Life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 with Neil Johnson on Vision.
Life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision.
Well, new research is showing that Aussies are increasingly open to religious and spiritual matters, with almost half of Generation Z, that's 46%, engaging with TikTok, at least weekly, to help them with their spiritual life. The new McCrindle research report called Changing Faith Landscape in Australia, which surveys over 2,000 Australians, has found almost half of Aussies are extremely or very open to a spiritual conversation that involves a differing perspective to their own. Sophie Renton is Managing Director of McCrindle Research. Sophie's back with us. Sophie, welcome back to 2020.
Thanks for having me.
Sophie, for some it might be a surprise to see that TikTok actually appears in the research. Give us your insights here.
Yes, this is a great question to actually formulate because we wanted to zoom out and look at spiritual well-being as a whole as to where, I guess in the light of the context of well-being growing across our society and having that as a spiritual concept, like where are people going for their spiritual development, makes it a bit easier for Australians overall to engage with. So we wanted to understand where are Australians going to develop their own spirituality? What platforms are they turning to? And that was where this insight around TikTok came out. And it is absolutely fascinating that for 46% of Gen Zs, they turn to TikTok at least weekly to help them in their spiritual life. And as you can imagine, that is much lower for our older generations. YouTube and Facebook were the ones that were engaged with more across all of the generations. And interestingly, 18% of Gen Zs actually engage with the metaverse at least weekly to help them in their spiritual life. So it's fascinating insight.
Just for context, of course, Gen Z, those who were born 1995 to 2009. So those who are, that later teenage up to 25 years of age, this is the generation we're talking about that is actually using TikTok more.
It is. So they use TikTok in their life generally, more so than older generations, but they're increasingly using it to help them navigate spirituality and to, I guess, a platform for their own personal growth. They use it for a search engine. It's becoming a key platform that Gen Z are engaging with.
Now, Sophie, it's easy to assume, isn't it, that younger Australians are closed to faith conversations, but your research shows that they are actually not.
Yes, I think this is probably one of the most helpful insights for people that came out of this research is that there can be a sense and a feeling, if we go on anecdotal experience, that people around us are closed to Christianity, to the concept of talking about religion. Our research, however, found that younger generations particularly are more likely to be open to have these conversations around spirituality, around religion, and are open to exploring that, and particularly even listening to ideas that are different to their own or open to changing their viewpoint if they're presented with different evidence as well.
And in the big picture, all Aussies, you've identified also that 2 in 3 are at least slightly open to changing their current religious views. That's quite surprising too.
It is quite surprising, and I think the key part of that is that if they're presented with the right evidence or if they're presented with the right circumstances, that's when they're open to changing their current religious views. But I think that is really interesting insight and probably speaks to some of the landscape in our society around how core people are holding religious views. I think historically religious views were a lot more linked to identity, whereas maybe these days other things are defining identity, and religion is a little bit more looked at something that can be put on and off. I'm not saying that's the right way. I think that's just a reflection of our society, and so there's a greater openness to exploring different things or different religions in their own.
Interesting, isn't it? You can talk about how positive some Aussies might be, and we'd all be governed by our own perceptions of what our neighbours and our work colleagues are like. But when you frame it as not as negative towards Christianity as is often presented, that's another way of looking at it in a very interesting way.
Yes, this we used from, I guess, what's called a modified Engel scale. But really what we found is that 3 in 10 Australians are Christian, 1 in 4 are warm to much of Christianity, and 1 in 8 are actually neutral, believing Christians and churches should have religious freedoms, but they just don't want to be involved, which shows that 28% fall into that cool category. Now, that is almost a third of Australians, but it's maybe not quite as many as people can feel based on their circumstances. That voice is very amplified in our society at the moment.
Cold, cool and warm. Interesting way of being able to talk about the way people respond. But when people are either cool or warm, that's actually a positive.
It helps us understand where people are at, and it helps us maybe have discussions and go on that journey with them.
What does your research show about younger Australians and the spaces in society that are appropriate to talk about religion? How does that look?
So our younger Australians are actually more likely to believe that all spaces in society are appropriate to talk about religion, and particularly social media. So 77% of Gen Z believe social media is an appropriate space to talk about religion and spirituality, compared to just over half of baby boomers. So we can look historically and see that our baby boomer generation are a lot more likely to view religion as something that's personal and closed and maybe not discussed as openly, whereas our younger generation are a lot more open to it being discussed within the realms of life, but not in a way of being converted. I guess those are probably the key distinguishers there.
Well, baby boomers, perhaps technically, because they're a whole lot older and this has not been their generation with all this social media, that Gen Z has a different way of looking at what is appropriate and whereabouts. What about all of the other different platforms for social media? I mean, we've been talking about TikTok. What about the others?
So there's a number of different areas where people choose to engage: Instagram, Facebook, and all of those. So it is across all of the platforms that this younger generation, they have a lot more comfortability engaging there. It's a lot more, I guess, engaged in their day-to-day life. And then in that sense of being authentic and true to themselves, that's where religion and spirituality can be discussed on those platforms there.
And Sophie, so far as we might look more broadly about Australians and their attitudes to the local church, what sort of things have you found in your research?
So what's interesting is that Australians know more about Jesus than they do about their local church. So many Australians actually don't know a lot about the churches in their area. And when we asked about the impact of the local church, so is this positive, is this neutral, is it negative? Only 5% said that the impact of their local church was negative. But what was really interesting is that 38% don't know well enough to answer. And so I think this is a kind of key area for churches to consider, is how well do the people in their local area actually know what they're doing, and maybe that's a task for them to consider how they can communicate what they're doing in a greater way.
What about the openness of Aussies to attend a church service? Sometimes we don't invite because we think people automatically will say no, but is that the case?
We found that 68% of Australians would actually be at least slightly likely to attend a Christian service or event if they were personally invited by a friend or a family member. And it's that personal connection that is a really key distinguisher here, because we had a follow-up question to this and we asked those that had said yes, why they would go, and often it was the relationship to honour the person who had asked them. And then those that didn't, it was often that they would feel hypocritical, maybe going along to something that they didn't actually believe in.
And if we were thinking about what difference does it make if I invite someone to go along to my local church, some evidence that you've got in your research that relationships within church life are actually one of our big positives. We've got some great things and great stories to tell.
Definitely. What Australians most value about the local church is that supportive community, the social connections, and even what the church puts on to support the local community. It is that sense of community that is so strong and is such a key distinguisher of the church, and particularly the intergenerational communities that can be provided, as a lot of those gathering points in our society are increasingly being dismantled.
And general attitudes to the local church, with all of the upheaval that goes on around the world, the uncertainty that we find ourselves in with these times, what sort of perceptions are there around the church and these particular times for the context of where we might be with the local church?
So most of the, perceptions or experience towards the church is in a positive realm. It is what Australians overall really value, about the church is that care that they provide for people. So looking after people that were homeless was what Australians most value. The offering of financial assistance was also valued when they think about the church as a whole. So there is a lot that the Australian church does contribute to the Australian society.
And trust for the overall institution. What does your research show about the church there?
So what was interesting in this was that we compared trust in the church to some other areas in society as well, so around mainstream media and government. And what we found is that largely trust in the local church, schools, Christians and the church broadly has largely stayed the same, which once again is a little bit different to maybe what people would think or feel based on their current context. The areas that we found over the last 3 years that people were more likely to say that their trust had decreased was mainstream media, government, large corporations and banks. So that's quite a positive story for Christians in the church.
Well, Sophie, good insights in that research, and no doubt there'll be listeners, as some will want to go a little deeper into this and actually access the report and have a look at it. Can they do that by visiting your website? Is it mcgrindle.com.au? Can you access the report there?
The best place to access the report would be cityinfield.com, which is where we provide a lot of our faith-based insights, and you can jump on that website and download it for free.
So to access that report, you can go to cityinfield.com. Sophie Renton is Managing Director of McCrindle Research. Sophie, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us today on 2020.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au. Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.